The call came on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong kind of day. Wednesdays had a particular quality in Harrow Falls. Not bad exactly, just unfinished. The kind of day that started with good intentions and ended with a list of things that didn't get done. Cormac Briggs had learned to distrust Wednesdays years ago, back when the plant in Windsor was still running 3 shifts and the engineers stayed late to argue about tolerances over bad coffee. He'd been one of those engineers. He wasn't anymore. He was under a '94 Silverado when the phone rang, his back flat against the cold concrete, a flashlight clamped in his teeth, and his hands already black to the wrist. The garage didn't have a lift, hadn't for 2 years, since the hydraulic cylinder on the old one blew, and the quote to fix it came back at $4,000. He'd thought about it for a week, and then bought a decent creeper instead. Some problems you solved with money, some you just went around, Dad. His daughter Fenn's voice from the doorway that connected the garage to the house. She was 8, and she had the habit of appearing without warning in doorways, just standing there until he noticed her. Phone, it's not anyone I know. He rolled out. The Silverado's exhaust manifold could wait. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Professional, unhurried, the kind of voice that had been doing this long enough to make it sound easy. Is this Cormac Briggs, former senior engineer, Drevitt Automotive? He said it was. My name is Laurel Voss. I'm the director of asset disposition for the Caldwell Group. He knew the name. Everyone in southern Ontario who'd spent any time in the auto industry knew the Caldwell Group. Catherine Caldwell had built it from a parts distribution company into something considerably larger over 30 years, and the thing it was now, a private holding company with its fingers in manufacturing, logistics, and a motorsport division that had done well enough at Le Mans to get written up in places that didn't normally write about Canadian companies, was a long way from where it started. Catherine Caldwell was occasionally described in the financial press as ruthless, which Cormac understood to be shorthand for effective and female. We have a situation, Laurel Voss said. The situation, as she described it, was this. The Caldwell Group's motorsport division had recently decommissioned 8 high-performance engines from a prototype racing program. The program itself had been canceled following a change in regulatory categories, and the engines, built to a specification that no longer corresponded to any active racing class, had been sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse outside Hamilton for 14 months. The accountants wanted them gone. They were listed as fully depreciated. As far as the balance sheet was concerned, they had no value. We're prepared to transfer them, Laurel Voss said. No cost. We'd need documentation of the transfer and confirmation that they won't be returned to competitive use without licensing. Other than that, they're yours. Cormac was quiet for a moment. Why me? A pause on her end. Your name came up. You have a history with this type of engine architecture. There aren't many people in the country who do. He didn't ask how his name came up. He had some guesses. Can I see them first? Of course. He drove to Hamilton on a Friday, leaving Fenn with the Doucets next door and a note that said back by dinner. The warehouse was on the industrial edge of the city, near the lake, and it smelled the way all warehouses smelled. Concrete and dust, and the faint chemical memory of things that had been stored there before. A man named Garrett showed him back through the rows of shelving without saying much. He was the kind of warehouse worker who'd learned that people who came to look at things usually needed to be left alone to do it. The engines were on a long wooden pallet in the back corner, covered with tarps. 8 of them. Cormac pulled the first tarp back and crouched down and looked. They were beautiful, not in a way that most people would have recognized, but he recognized it. The castings were clean. The machining on the block faces was precise, in a way that suggested someone had cared at some point about getting it right. The heads were a design he'd seen referenced in technical documents, but never in person, a narrow-angle configuration that had been developed for a specific downforce profile and then abandoned when the aerodynamic rules changed. He pressed 2 fingers against the block of the nearest one and held them there. How long did you say they'd been sitting? 14 months, Garrett said from somewhere behind him. Cormac nodded slowly. 14 months in a climate-controlled space. If the previous custodians had been careful, and the machining suggested they had been, these engines hadn't degraded in any meaningful way. They were dormant. There was a difference between dormant and dead, and it was a difference most people didn't bother to learn. He looked at all 8 of them. He took his time. On the drive home, he stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Brantford and sat in the parking lot with a medium coffee and did the math on a paper bag. It wasn't complicated math, but it took a while because he kept stopping to reconsider his assumptions. When he was satisfied that his assumptions were reasonable, he looked at the number he'd written down and then looked at it again. He drove the rest of the way home in the particular silence of a man who has just made a decision and not yet told anyone about it. Harrow Falls had not been Cormac's plan. His plan, to the extent that he'd had one at the age of 32, had been Windsor. The plant there was one of the largest automotive manufacturing facilities in the country, and when he'd been hired into their advanced engineering division, it had felt like the beginning of something. He was good at his work in the way that made other engineers quietly take note. Not flashy, not political, but precise in a way that bordered on instinctive. He understood why engines failed. He understood it not as an abstract mechanical principle, but as a kind of diagnosis, the way a doctor might understand why a body fails, by reading signs that weren't obvious until you knew what you were looking at. He met Seo Circe at a conference in Toronto in 2009. She was a structural engineer from Sudbury who had no particular interest in automotive and found the conference itself somewhat tedious, which she told him directly over bad white wine at the reception. He'd found this clarifying. They were married within the year. Fenn was born in 2016. Circe died in 2018. The details of how she died were not the kind Cormac revisited often, because the details were mundane in the way that only actual tragedies can be. Not dramatic, not meaningful, just a blood clot in a place where blood clots shouldn't be, discovered too late. She had been 34 years old, and she had been healthy, and she had been in every ordinary sense fine, until she wasn't. He stayed in Windsor for 2 years after, because he didn't know what else to do. His mother had died when he was in university. His father had retired to Nova Scotia and wasn't especially well. The plant was something to go to. Work was something to do. Fenn went to daycare and then junior kindergarten, and he picked her up every evening and made dinner and put her to bed, and then sat in the living room of a house that had been bought by 2 people and was now occupied by 1.5, and tried to figure out what came next. What came next was Harrow Falls, which was neither his plan nor anyone's plan, but which was where his mother's cousin had left a property when she died with no closer heirs. A house and a detached garage on 3/4 of an acre on the edge of a town of 6,000 people about 90 minutes from anywhere you'd want to be. He took the job at the plant in Woodstock part-time for 18 months, commuting twice a week, and used the rest of his time to build the garage into something that could pay. There was no shortage of older vehicles in towns like Harrow Falls, and there was often no one capable of working on them properly. He fixed trucks and station wagons, and occasionally, things he had no business being able to fix, but managed anyway, because he'd spent enough years understanding the underlying principles that the surface variations didn't confuse him. Fenn grew up in the garage the way children grow up in the places where their parents work. She knew the names of tools before she knew how to read. She handed him things without being asked. She asked questions that were inconvenient and usually interesting. He was 41 when Laurel Voss called. Getting all 8 engines from Hamilton to Harrow Falls took 2 trips and a rented flatbed and the help of his neighbor, Perry Doucette, who was 63 and had a bad knee but wouldn't hear of not helping. They laid the engines out in the garage on a system of wooden pallets. Cormac had spent 2 weeks building specifically for this purpose, and Perry stood in the doorway afterwards with his arms crossed and looked at them. "What are they worth?" Perry asked. "Depends on what I do with them. What are you going to do with them?" "I don't know yet," Cormac said, which was not entirely true. What he knew, or believed, which at this stage was the same thing, was that there was a specific and narrow market for engines built to this specification. Not the racing market, which the licensing restriction had closed, but the collector market, which operated by different rules. The regulatory changes that had made these engines obsolete for competition had also, somewhat paradoxically, made them interesting as artifacts. The prototype program that had produced them had been well regarded within the motorsport community. The engines existed in very small numbers. There were people, serious, well-resourced people, who collected things like this the way other people collected paintings. The question was whether he could do what he believed he could do, which was restore these engines to full operating condition and document that restoration in a way that a buyer would pay for. The question was also whether he could do it without telling anyone why he was doing it, because if he talked about this before he had something to show, he would spend the next 18 months answering questions he couldn't yet answer. So he didn't talk about it. He worked in the evenings and on weekends. The regular garage work paid the bills, the trucks and the station wagons, and the occasional transmission job that came to him by referral, because people in surrounding towns had heard he was good. He did that work during business hours. After Fenn was in bed, he worked on the engines. The first one took him 11 weeks. There was a satisfaction to it that was different from regular shop work, which he'd stopped noticing years ago the way you stop noticing background noise. This was something else. The engine had been designed by people who had been trying to solve a specific problem: how to produce maximum power within a specific regulatory envelope under conditions of extreme mechanical stress for a defined duration. And the solutions they'd found were elegant in some places and pragmatic in others, and occasionally slightly wrong in ways that he could see and correct. He found a casting flaw in the third cylinder that the original builders had either missed or accepted. He corrected it. He found a lubrication path that had been adequate but not optimal. He improved it. He worked slowly. He documented everything. Fenn came into the garage one Saturday morning while he was finishing the headwork on Engine 2 and sat on the old wooden stool she'd claimed as hers years ago and watched him for a while. "Are those race car engines?" she asked. "They were going to be. What are they now?" He thought about it. "There's something else now." She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had grown up around incomplete answers. She picked up a washer from the bench and turned it over in her hands. "Mrs. Doucette says you're doing something secret," she said. "Mrs. Doucette is very perceptive." "Is it a good secret or a bad secret?" "A good one," he said, "I think." He'd been working on Engine 4 when the letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope with a return address in Burlington, and it was from a man named Hugh Adler who identified himself as a solicitor representing a client he declined to name. The letter was polite and professionally worded, and it said, in essence, that Mr. Adler's client had become aware that Cormac was in possession of a number of engines that had originated from the Caldwell Group's decommissioned prototype program, and that his client had an interest in acquiring these engines and would be prepared to offer a sum. The letter specified a number that his client considered generous. The number was not generous. The number was, in fact, less than Cormac had already turned down from a collector in Stuttgart who'd reached out through a motorsport forum 8 weeks earlier. He put the letter in the top drawer of his desk and thought about it for a few days. Then he called Laurel Voss. "Did you pass along my information?" he asked. A pause. "What do you mean?" "Someone has made an offer for the engines." "Through a solicitor. I'm wondering how they knew to find me." Another pause, this one longer. "That didn't come from us." He believed her. The Caldwell Group had nothing to gain from it, and Laurel Voss had struck him as a person who said what she meant. But if the information hadn't come from the group, it had come from somewhere, and the number of people who knew what he had in his garage was small. Perry Doucette, a parts supplier in Guelph he'd ordered components through. A machinist in Cambridge who'd done some specialized work for him on the second engine and had been appropriately discreet about it, or so Cormac had thought. He drove to Cambridge. The machinist's name was Saul Frey, and he had a small shop on the east side of the city and a reputation that was generally good. Cormac liked him. They'd worked together twice before on jobs that required precision Saul was capable of and most other shops weren't. He didn't accuse Saul of anything. He sat in the plastic chair across from Saul's desk and told him about the letter and watched Saul's face. Saul's face did something complicated. "I didn't sell your information," Saul said. "I didn't say you did. But you're here." "I'm here," Cormac agreed. Saul was quiet for a moment. Then, "I may have mentioned the project. To someone I was talking to about work. I didn't say whose project. I didn't give your name. You gave enough." Saul didn't argue with that. The man Saul had mentioned the project to was a business contact named Reuben Quarles, who was, as best Cormac could determine through a few hours of careful research that evening, a broker of industrial and mechanical assets. The kind of person who connected buyers with things buyers wanted before the sellers knew they were selling. He called the number on the letter and spoke briefly with Hugh Adler, and told him the engines weren't for sale. Then he changed the locks on the garage and installed a camera system he'd been meaning to install for 2 years. The thing about working on something alone, in the evenings for months, is that it gives you a great deal of time to think about things other than what you're working on. The mind goes where it goes. Cormac's went, often, to Sursee. Not the end of it, which he'd spent the years since Harrow Falls trying to stop returning to, but the middle of it, the part that was ordinary. The way she'd read on the couch with her feet tucked under her, the particular impatience in her voice when a meeting had run long. The morning after a snowstorm when they'd both stood at the window of the Windsor house and watched the street and not said much because there wasn't much to say, and it had been one of the better mornings he could remember. He thought about Fen a lot. The way she was now at 8 was not the way she'd been at 5 or at 3. And he'd noticed with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite grief that he could no longer remember, very precisely, what she'd been like at those earlier ages. The way children change is fast enough to erase itself. You can't look away for a moment without losing something. He thought sometimes about what Sursee would have made of the engines. She would have found the engineering interesting and the collector market puzzling, which seemed right. He didn't think much about Reuben Quarles until Quarles called him directly. The call came at 9 on a Tuesday evening, which was already the wrong kind of time. Cormac was working on engine 6. He looked at the unfamiliar number and answered it. "Mr. Briggs, my name is Reuben Quarles. I think you know why I'm calling." The voice was pleasant, unhurried in a different way than Laurel Voss had been unhurried. The unhurriedness of someone who believed they had leverage. "I turned down the offer," Cormac said. "I know. I'd like to discuss the reasoning behind that. The reasoning is that they're not for sale. Everything is for sale at some price." This was probably true in a general philosophical sense, but it wasn't useful. "I'm working on something," Cormac said. "When it's done, I'll sell what I'm selling to who I'm selling it to. That's not going to change." There was a pause. "The collector market is smaller than you think, and the people in it talk to each other." He understood the implication. He'd considered it already. "Then I'll find buyers outside it," he said, and ended the call. He found the first buyer without trying. The Motorsport forum post he'd written 6 months earlier, a careful, technical description of the engine specifications, posted without identifying himself or his location, intended to assess interest without committing to anything, had been read more widely than he'd expected. In November, a reply came from a man named Tom Callender, who introduced himself as a vehicle curator for a private automotive collection in British Columbia. The collection belonged to a family he didn't name. They were interested in historical racing hardware. They had specific interest in this prototype program. Cormac spoke to Callender twice by phone before they agreed to meet. He came to Harrow Falls in December, 2 days before the snowstorm that closed the 401 for 6 hours and made the news, which Callender found more interesting than alarming. He was a quiet man in his mid-50s who wore a canvas jacket and asked questions that told Cormac, within about 15 minutes, that he actually understood what he was looking at. Callender spent 2 hours in the garage. He examined the completed engines, 4 of them by then, with the particular attention of someone who had seen a great many engines and had learned to distinguish between restoration and fabrication, between original intent preserved and original intent guessed at. "You've kept everything," Callender said, looking at the documentation Cormac had assembled. 3 binders, 1 per completed engine, with photographs at each stage and notes on every decision. "It's the work," Cormac said. "The documentation is part of the work." Callender looked up. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not much, just enough to indicate that this answer had confirmed something. They agreed on a price for 4 engines, pending verification of the transfer documentation from the Caldwell Group. The price was what Cormac had calculated was fair, multiplied by a factor he hadn't quite let himself believe in until Callender wrote it down. After Callender left, Cormac sat in the garage alone for a while. The space heater ticked. The 4 remaining engines sat on their pallets in the back corner, waiting. He could see his breath in the cold air. He thought about calling his father in Nova Scotia. He decided against it. Not because he didn't want to tell him, but because the thing wasn't finished yet, and he had a superstition, not seriously held but present, about talking about things before they were finished. He went inside. Fenn was asleep. He made tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the frozen backyard and felt something that it took him a moment to identify. It felt like the gap between a problem and its solution, which was the moment he'd always liked best. After the diagnosis, before the confirmation. The moment when you believed you were right but hadn't yet been told so. The second call from Reuben Quarles came in January. This time the tone was different. Less pleasant, not threatening exactly, but with the texture of something that could become threatening if the conversation went the wrong way. Quarles had apparently learned about Calendar's visit. Cormac was not surprised. Harrow Falls was small enough that a man arriving in a rental car and spending 2 hours in the garage of the local mechanic was noticeable, and noticeable things eventually reached people who were paying attention. "You've made an arrangement," Quarles said. "That's my business. My client believed he had a prior claim on those engines. He didn't. He had an interest." "Lots of people have interests," Cormac said. "Interests don't create claims." He could hear the calculation in the pause that followed. "Mr. Briggs, you're working in a fairly isolated situation. Business partners, no legal representation, as far as I can tell. If there were to be a dispute about the provenance of those engines..." "There won't be," Cormac said. "I have the transfer documentation from the Caldwell Group. I have Laurel Voss's direct line. I have 3 years of receipts for the parts and materials I've used in the restoration. I have documentation for every stage of that restoration. If your client wants to introduce a provenance dispute into this, he's welcome to try." Another pause, longer this time. "My client is a patient man." "I'm sure he is," Cormac said. "I'm not particularly patient, but I am thorough as a difference." The call ended shortly after that. He called Laurel Voss the next morning and explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd have their legal team issue a formal statement confirming the transfer. It arrived by email within the hour. He forwarded it to Calendar and filed the original in the binder he'd started keeping specifically for correspondence related to this. He didn't hear from Quarles again. The last 4 engines took him through the winter and into early spring. Engine 7 gave him the most trouble. A crack in the block that he'd missed in his initial assessment, or that had developed during storage, and that required a repair he'd never attempted on this specific alloy before. He spent 3 weeks on it. He read everything he could find on the subject, called a metallurgist at the University of Waterloo whose name appeared on a paper he found useful, and eventually solved the problem in a way that he was confident about and documented in 11 pages. Fenn turned 9 in March. He made her a cake that was technically correct and aesthetically imperfect, which she found satisfying. "Are you almost done?" she asked. "Getting there." "What happens when you're done?" He'd thought about this. Not the sale, that was logistics, but the after of it. The garage would go back to trucks and station wagons. The pallets would be dismantled. The space that had held these 8 things for almost 2 years would hold other things. "We'll figure out what's next," he told her. "Can we get a dog? We can talk about a dog." She accepted this as the provisional yes that it was. The last engine was finished in May, on a Saturday late in the afternoon, when the light through the garage windows was long and orange and the garage smelled of metal and clean oil and the particular dry smell of reference manuals that had been handled too many times. Cormac stood back and looked at all 8 of them. Complete, documented, ready. He thought about Catherine Caldwell, who had looked at these engines and seen nothing. He did not think of this with any particular judgment. He understood the logic of it, the balance sheet, the depreciated value, the cost of storage against the cost of disposal. It was a reasonable conclusion from the available data. It was just the wrong conclusion. The data had not included him. Tom Calendar came back in June with the transport arranged and the final payment processed. They loaded the engines in a sequence that Calendar had planned and that Cormac had independently verified, because they were both the kind of people who verified each other's plans, not from distrust, but from habit. Perry Doucette came over to watch, as he had when they were unloaded, and stood with his arms crossed in the doorway. "So?" Perry said. Cormac told him the number. Perry was quiet for a moment. "For engines that somebody threw out. For engines that needed the right person to look at them." Perry considered this. He had the expression he got when something confirmed a view he'd held for a long time without ever quite articulating. "Your wife would have liked to know about this." "Yeah," Cormac said. "She would have." After the transport left, he walked back through the empty space where the engines had been. The pallets were still there. He'd dismantle them this weekend, or next. The light was good. It was the kind of evening that arrived in Ontario in June like an apology for everything the winter had been, warm and long and unhurried. Finn appeared in the doorway that connected the garage to the house. 8 years old, and then 9, and now almost 10. She looked at the empty space. Are they gone? They're gone. She came in and stood beside him and looked at where they'd been. What do we do now? She asked. He looked at the space, at the light, at the oil stains on the concrete, at the tools hanging on the wall exactly where they'd always been. We find the next thing, he said. She put her hand in his, the way she'd done when she was smaller, and he held it the way he always had, and outside the light went on being what it was, long and unhurried and not finished with them yet,